them is weird.
So I've switched it to the ones that are
On this laptop.
yeah, and the laptops. That's what they look at the minute.
So
Oh, okay.
go through again.
That's fine. It just looked weird a second ago, though.
Yeah. I think because you've just switched it. I think
Oh,
when
fine.
you
Yeah.
when you copied them over to your laptop, it just didn't. But it's fine now. Great.
Yeah, and then the rest of them are on the desktop here.
Yeah.
So and then you can just get people to chuck theirs, and then
Nice.
it's in PowerPoint.
Is there a way, like, do you know when we're swapping between slides, in between each panel?
Yeah.
Is there a way to take it off the screen for a minute, load up the slides, get it ready?
I'll do it. I wonder if you have.
I'll have them all up.
What was cutting when I go to that one?
It's fine here.
Yeah.
It was just when it was on your laptop. Oh, it was like this, the G was dropping,
To there.
and then if you click on this
Oh
slide,
yeah.
you know where it says here, show your support for the planning application?
Yeah.
This formatting was weird, so it's like over here.
Okay. So what I had to do is convert it into a JPEG. So if you have those as JPEGs, or maybe that's why it went
I
weird.
think
But
that's why it went
I was using Keynote over there. But maybe if I do it in
Is there not,
Microsoft.
yeah, is there not Microsoft PowerPoint on that laptop?
No, only Keynote on that one back there.
Well, if we keep all the slides on this laptop, it's probably better then, so it doesn't let any like weird formatting issues.
I want file. I want to export as save as JPEGs, and then the other thing is the ATEM, which is the transfer thing, was normally set to cinema ratios, not like computer. So that's why it was also like.
This should be set to 16:9. Oh, but that's not cinema, is it?
Yeah. Oh, I used to have loads. Oh, here's one. Loads of USBs. But I'll just I'll try converting it here as what they call using Microsoft to this PC. We'll save it on the desktop. We want it as JPEGs or PNGs. Cool. Is that there? Holding line. Yeah, okay. So now I'm just gonna put that back. Need to rename it because it's already renamed. Cool. We want to check that now. I want to eject. Oh, I just can't do that.
Let's try it again. thinking, should I just give you a...
You keep one of the microphones because
from Dan into infill?
No, Dan, then me.
Okay. So they're just swapping.
Yeah. Just need to go do the loop.
And Barry Parsons.
No, Louise Davis instead. She's from the council.
So I'm still asking the same question.
Yes. See where Louise is. He's stuck on the train, so we're swapping Dan here is going to speak first. No, Dan Hill's going to speak first. So that's fine.
So
I'm going to look for Louise for the council.
and Louise, what's the
She's head of branding and delivery. So this is Anne. This is Ashley. Nice to meet you. It's a bit tricky. If I screw up the live stream, it's going to be the show. PowerPoint is like what program are you on? Oh, you're on here. Let me go ask Nora, the technician. Bear with me.
just to keep it smooth. I'll get you another stick.
We're going to need to put it on a USB stick. Nora's gone to get one.
I just realised I just left that in Vietnam.
Classic.
That's where I was on Friday and I was like copying files across there.
Oh, have you just flown over?
Yes.
Yeah, them Apple ones are dodgy, so
I've got a dongle here.
yeah, you can have that. That's great, yeah.
I did ask them all to send the slides when they were back to work, that never happened.
Oh yeah. Does smell about it. Yeah, just some of those like really posh new Apple Macs.
They were
They're
like
set
120
to-
hertz.
Yeah, and like it buses with the signal. So
Fun.
yeah, makes my job interesting. What's gone wrong now?
Who knows?
But you're
Classic.
okay for all of that sort of like.
Yeah, I can pop his slides on.
And that's looking great though. So
Yeah.
got chatting with
Yeah. Cool. That's all
GTX. That one, I guess. Yeah, actually. Yeah, we can make it.
It's going to copy it to the desktop in case there's any issues.
Let's just open it up and see what happens. So we just have a quick flick through.
Yeah, if you...
Yeah, looks great. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's right. This is so last minute. I wasn't due to do this
Did
at
you
all.
fly over on Friday?
No, yesterday.
Oh my god. Great. Cool. So, Laura, so Angelique is going to be our chair. And she's going to introduce all our partners and all this and kick us all off. And then Dan is going to speak first.
Okay.
So I'll have his slides ready.
Great.
And then,
Cool. And that's on the mic, so
okay, great. Thank you. Great day. I think if you make the call to get everyone in their seats and start getting them to
yeah.
kick off.
1 minute. Good evening. Could everyone please take their seats? Thank you. It's a bit like, it's very low, you know? A bit too tall for that. Good evening. Good evening. Hello. Hello, hello. Oh, yes. Good evening. Welcome to Housing Reimagined. I am Angelique Retief, and I'm chairing this evening's conversation. But before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. So there's no scheduled fire drills or tests, as far as I'm aware. So if you do hear an alarm, please exit calmly via the exits at the back and to the side on your right. So a little bit about me. I lead the policy and development work at Black Southwest Network. We are a racial justice charity based in Bristol, but we work across the Southwest. And we work in all areas of social and public policy. Alongside that, I am also completing or finalizing my PhD at the University of Bristol, which explores, 7 years in, I should really have this down to a T, but I don't. It explores how we evaluate community-led housing, basically. So not just in terms of, generally when we evaluate housing, we use numerical kind of figures, so how many homes have been built, how many people have been housed in those homes. But I suppose the evaluation framework that I've sought to develop evaluates homes in terms of relationships built, in terms of the support, collective well-being, relational well-being. And so we often build housing expecting a community to suddenly emerge. But my research, I suppose, asks how do we embed care? How do we embed accountability, mutual support? Into the foundations of what we're building. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight, not just because of the quality of the work that we're going to be discussing, but because of the conversation that we have feels genuinely timely and necessary. So we know that the home is more than a structure. It's the first infrastructure of everyday life. It shapes how we live, how we care, how we connect, and how we build futures. So right now, far too many people, as we know, have that foundation fractured or entirely missing. So the government has promised 1.5 million new homes in the life of this parliament. Last week's spending review also announced a major investment in affordable housing. But without deeper shifts in what we build, how and where and for whom, we risk repeating the same patterns, leaving the same communities behind, exacerbating inequality, and locking in carbon at exactly the moment when we need to be cutting it. What makes tonight's conversation so exciting is the Multimax report being launched this evening offers not just a set of proposals, but a provocation. That it's possible to deliver deeply affordable, low-carbon homes that are designed for people and the planet, not in the future, but right now. Here in Bristol and in other parts of the UK, we're beginning to see how practical community-led innovations can point the way forward. I've been fortunate to work alongside projects that are actively exploring what it means to do housing differently, where climate justice, racial justice, spatial justice are not treated as separate issues, but are interconnected. And I've been really pleased that BSWN and We Can Make have been able to work together to secure 3 sites in community-led housing in South Bristol. And we're beginning to show how development of new homes can be intersectional. It can address spatial, racial, and climate justice together. Our collaboration is driven by a shared recognition of the urgent need to bring spatial, racial, and climate justice together in order to develop the kinds of homes and social infrastructure needed to enable everyone to thrive. There is a huge role for community-led housing to play here, diversifying the type of homes delivered to better match the growing cultural diversity of people, develop agency of diverse communities to lead change, and to ensure that any new housing counters rather than reinforces structural inequalities, be that race, class, age, or gender. Tonight we'll be hearing from an incredible panel, people who are not only asking the right questions, but are also building new systems, new partnerships and new tools for the kind of transformation that we urgently need. So thank you for being here. Thank you to We Can Make for convening this moment, and thank you to the Watershed for hosting us so generously. So to help get us started, I'm going to hand over to Dan Hill, who is a designer, urbanist, educator, and experienced leader at the intersection of design, technology, and cities. Dan is director of Melbourne School of Design and professor in built environment at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. That was a mouthful. Thank you so much. You're welcome to use either this or that mic just there.
Do I have to stand here like this? I think so. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great, thank you. So I've just landed from Melbourne, and Melissa said to me, would you mind coming to give a talk in about 10 minutes, more or less? That's not strictly true. She did ask me to come onto the panel. I'm really happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me, and thanks for hosting this event, and thanks for that great intro. This is a really important launch, I think, in numerous ways of this work. I was talking to somebody on the way here, and they said, why is this so interesting? And I said, well, it's community land trust and participation and fabrication systems and a materials ecosystem and then different financing. I mean, basically, it's got everything in it, which is really lovely to see such a systemic approach taken. And then to lead that with prototypes and projects, which make it really tangible, is the best thing you can do. Reports tend not to change things too much, in my experience. Projects really do. Reports are important because they're like the vapor trail left by the project, in a way. They capture the learning from it, and that's what the report that you should download is about. But really, this is about projects and making things happen. So in that spirit, I'll just talk a little bit about why it's necessary then, and then in the panel and others speakers can get onto what it is and how it might work. And you might be wondering why there's a photo of the Australian Prime Minister. I bet most of you don't even know that is the Australian Prime Minister. That's Anthony Albanese, who just got elected with a crushing majority victory number, and he, like the British government, has embarked on a housing-led approach of building, in Australia's case, 200,000 homes a year over the next 5 years, so similar in a sense, prorated down numbers to the UK. But you see the way it's presented in the Australian media. Channel 9 is sort of, I don't know, the ITV2 of Australian news channels. And it's like there's, you know, $100 bills raining from the sky somehow. And there's a concerned-looking politician, and then there's a suburban sprawl going on to the horizon in the background. It's kind of everything in one image, I suppose. And I will use Australia just to sort of start this before I get into a bigger picture, because Australia is kind of an extreme version of the UK housing market to some degree. So it has all of the conditions of the UK housing market, but somehow more so. So it's interesting to reflect on as a counterpoint. We've been doing work in Shepparton in Australia, a different Shepparton, not the Shepparton in West London, the Shepparton in Victoria, and it's perennially flooding. It always will flood, always has flooded. The original indigenous name for Shepparton in the Yorta Yorta language, which is the traditional owner of the land here, translates to the place in the river where you catch the big fish, which gives you a clue that it's a pretty damp place, and it has been forever. And there's multiple rivers converging there all the time. So these huge floods were here in 2022. I know it looks quite nice in a way, like a sort of suburban Venice, but it's not, wasn't very pleasant for people there. And you see, this is the Climate Council in Australia, their list of the municipalities most likely to have an uninsurable housing by 2030. And you see 90% of the houses in Shepparton are at high risk of being uninsurable by 2030 because of the flooding. That flooding, of course, is supposed to happen. It's inundation. It's a natural system. That's what rivers are supposed to do. They're supposed to move the nutrients around the soil. That's why the soil is fertile. It's why things grow. We've turned that into a natural disaster. Shepparton is known as the place where you grow apples and pears in Australia because of that flooding. But you see that land is being sold off, and the pear trees are being torn down and turned into housing. And the kind of housing that's getting built, it looks like this. This is, Australia has the largest house sizes in the world, an average of about 240, 245 square meters, which is enormous. The people per household has been going down since the late 60s. You see in the bottom left there, in 1969, there were about 3.3 people per household. Now there's about 2.6, so it's almost a third fewer, but actually the size of the house has doubled in that time, 120 to 240. So this is what I mean by an extreme housing market in a way. That's just financialization driving the housing build. It doesn't really match the people that live there or the needs. Of course, that housing, this is in the hottest continent on the planet, is really badly built, not very well insulated, so incredibly hot in summer, very cool in winter, therefore takes a lot of energy to heat or cool. You see these same patterns in the UK, obviously, around our very old housing stock in this country, the oldest in Europe, which all needs retrofitting and regenerating in some way. The challenge is how we do that now, and I'll just move into just a bit of the scale of the problem. So all of these words, please don't try and read them, all that they add up to is the built environment sector is the most extractive on the planet, really, by far. It's about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, one way or another. And of course, that isn't just the only thing that's happening there. Those emissions are being, whenever we make bricks or concrete or steel, they're coming from places, raw materials being extracted from landscapes, from livelihood and things like that. It also shows up as carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, but equally it's social and ecologically damaging. Construction consumes almost all the planet's cement, 50% of the steel, quarter of the plastics and so on. There's not enough global mineral reserves on the planet to make all the renewable energy we need to drive all of that stuff. And you see on the top there, 97% of the existing EU building stock requires major upgrades. So it's a really gnarly problem, to use a technical term. We have to retrofit or rebuild everything, and at the same time, whenever we touch the construction system, emissions just start pouring out left, right, and center. And of course, there are some countries that are more responsible than others for all these emissions, just generally overall emissions terms. The global north and a handful of countries within it are responsible for all of that stuff, and yet it's the global south that is effectively being extracted now to be built from. So in the bottom right, we still have these housing targets, and those housing targets are important, obviously. It is a fundamental human right. In my view, everybody should have access to a good quality home, just as a foundation. Irrespective of how we get there, that should just be a foundational provision, if you like, of a society. However, if we're going to just keep on building, business as usual, all of those numbers come into play. And just to kind of finally make this point, whenever we're doing that, it's coming from places like this. So there's usually the sand to make cement, we're not really pulling that from the UK anymore. That's coming from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is really unknown. We don't really know often where materials are coming from. We sort of do technically in the system, but it gets lost even in the system amongst experts. And any room that we're in, I don't know if anybody knows where the materials that made this room come from. Some of you probably do, because this is a famous old building in a very old place, and we have good records for some of these things, and there's every chance, because of the age of this building, that people do know where that brick is from. Maybe Peter knows this kind of thing, but he's shaking his head. Usually we don't, right? Whenever I'm in a room, you can say, where's the room come from? Nobody has any idea, really. And it could be from, you know, in Australia, most of the lumber before the Ukraine war, the timber, was coming from Russia to Australia. So these kind of extraordinary global supply chains are behind every building, the sort of the iceberg behind the tip of the building. So that's really also the issue here, and we're a long way from fixing that. So some of you might think, well, there are clearly some leaders in this stuff, like Denmark's probably really good at this. Denmark's only 4% circular as a society overall. I'm not talking about buildings specifically, just overall, 96% of Denmark's stuff ends up in landfill, usually somewhere else, because we export that these days. Scotland's about 1.3%, just in case you're wondering. So I don't know where England is, but it'll be somewhere between Scotland and Denmark, I suppose. So again, some of you will be thinking, well, we can kind of optimize our way out of that. We're really good at optimizing. Yes and no. We are good as a species at being inventive and innovative, but we have to hit the hard reality of materials at some point, and we are on a finite amount of materials on this planet. And let's just ignore any crazy visions about going to Mars and things like that. Let's not even think about that. It's absurd. But this planet has enough stuff for us if we use it more carefully. But we're not tending to use that more carefully. So just to take an analogy, the UK car and van targets, the UK government's targets, this is for 2019, by 2050, all cars and vans should be electric. Sounds reasonable, you know, that's 25 years away. And yet to do that, if we just decided to do that, this paper found that that would take almost twice the amount of cobalt production in the world. Most of the lithium, most of the neodymium, most of the mined copper and so on, just to do the UK. So that's not including Japan, Netherlands, Nigeria, USA, like anything else. So we're still looking at these things as if there's an unlimited supply. We can just keep on making cars forever out of stuff that is magically going to be there forever. And we don't have to think about this as a global system where we actually have a finite amount of stuff that we have to think really carefully about. So this comes back to then housing and the way that we approach it. We have to be incredibly careful with the way that we make things now, which is why this project is so important, because it demonstrates a way of making things using, in this case, locally sourced materials and bringing them to bear very carefully in a way that they can be retrofitted and adapted continually without adding to all of those problems that we just talked about. That is game-changing if we can do that. But just to give a sense of what we need to do, we worked in Australian numbers again. We don't have these numbers for the UK. I'd quite like to do them if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards. We have these numbers for Denmark and Australia. If you look at all of the emissions in the world, there's about 53.9 billion tons. And then if you basically think of planetary boundaries under the Paris Agreement, which we've all signed up to, the Paris Agreement, every serious country in the world. I'm not including America as a serious country at this point, because that's opted out of it, but all of them except 6 have signed up to the Paris Agreement, including the UK. We've got to get 53.9 down to 2.51. So that's the kind of order of magnitude to hold within the Paris Agreement, which again is a legally binding, globally made agreement. That's to keep global warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees, okay? So you might know that we've probably already passed the 1.5 bit, but it would be good not to get anywhere near 2. So if you pro-rata that down to Australia, just say there's 26 million people in Australia, so our fair share of that is that, therefore our target needs to be that, that's our fair share of the target. There's lots of quibbles. Talk to me afterwards about how you do these numbers. And then let's look at buildings using the same pro-ratering. So the average Australian house is about 461 kilograms of emissions per square meter per year. We need to get that down to 6. That's the equivalent drop, a 98% drop in emissions per square meter. So again, this is just if we carry on business as usual, making houses, without thinking where they come from, continuing to make them in brick and steel and concrete and things like that. So we do know for Australia and the UK, that would use the entire carbon budget of our countries based on Paris if we carried on business as usual. So researchers at UCL have figured out just to do the, 300,000 homes a year in England, or the UK, sorry, would use our entire carbon budget. So no carbon budget left for football or fishing or industry, agriculture, anything. So we can't do that. We've got to really radically rethink. There's lots of ways we might do that. So we might say, instead of building 200,000 units of housing at 240 square meters, which is frankly twice as big as it needs to be, we could bring that down by half. That gives us a bit more carbon to play with. We're spreading this out over 10 years, so we can step down it bit by bit over a 10-year target. We might get there if we build fewer houses more carefully in the right places. So without going into the full detail, what this comes to might be a range of things we need to think about. So retrofit both places in the sense of houses and neighborhoods. So we can make in projects like this enable us to find spaces in neighborhoods that could carry new buildings built very carefully to enable a retrofit of the neighborhood from within, as well as retrofitting all the houses we've already got. That takes significant architectural invention. It's not easy to retrofit this stuff one way or another, either a place or a building again. So there's a real change we need to do around just assuming we can just carry on making houses as we used to. A fair go, sorry for the Australian language, fiscally just means let's look at the tax incentives and other fiscal incentives which at the moment drive this careless approach to housing, which is huge incentives actually for volume builders and things like mortgages, first home buyers, things like that. All of those incentivize actually the wrong outcomes at this point. Renewable energy, massively useful, whether it's to power a sawmill or to power a home. Either way, both are important. Regenerative materials, which is, again, we can make, is very good on both of those ones, by the way. Regenerative materials means usually circular biomaterials. So we're talking timber and hempcrete and straw bale and thatch, things like have not been in the English vernacular for some centuries in some cases, coming back in, which is really, really interesting. New jobs and new skills and new trades around all of that kind of stuff, using local materials full of provenance and culture and history. That's massively interesting. Way more interesting than importing UPVC window frames from who knows where, or timber from Russia or whatever. Less but better, carefully looking in the gaps. And so this again is saying if we can't build 300,000 homes a year because of that material cost, how do we give everybody a house, given that we need to? There's lots of ways we can do that, but we might look at the housing market in the UK and say, well, actually, we've oversupplied privately owned housing already. There's actually a surplus of that stuff. There's many, many empty homes in the UK, some of them in very viable locations, right? So what the shortage is public housing and shared housing. That's what there isn't enough of in the market, which is cooperatives, shared housing structures, things like that. Things, again, we'll talk to tonight. So if you've got a budget, you think carefully, well, what do I spend it on? I don't just spend it on everything. I don't spend it on the thing I've already got. I spend it on the things that we really need, which comes back to shared housing and public housing. That would be where we'd use a carbon budget very carefully in that case. In public leadership, I'll just finish on this, and then fabrication in building, modular building, some of the techniques you'll hear more from Dave about shortly. All of these things fit together as bits of a jigsaw puzzle, if you like. They're kind of the ingredients you can make a cake with. I'm not going to tell you how to make the cake or what the cake is. That needs to come from you. Every place will have a different version of that. But just for an example, on the capability building side, how do you make all of this stuff happen takes new kinds of partnerships with local government, city councils in particular, stepping up and being meaningful actors in this space, which means they need to be resourced in terms of their capabilities and their funding to do that, regionally as well. National government could help there. For an example of that, and I know this is referred to in the report as a mission around housing, essentially, Mission-oriented innovation just means bringing a load of things together with a shared direction, public, private, community, working together, top down and bottom up, lots of projects, all heading in that direction. So a great British housing mission, as it's referred to in the paper, would be a good target. The thinking behind that, you can look at my colleague at UCL, Mariana Mazzucato, but an example of that we did in Sweden. We looked at streets instead of housing, but just very briefly looked at how do we retrofit all the streets in the country, healthy, sustainable, and full of life. Would be, you can imagine what the equivalent for housing might be. The first thing you do is you gather together lots of stakeholders in the system, actually. So the bored-looking guy is a municipal transport planner. Sorry, he was a very nice guy. He's called Matthias. He was key to the project happening. But they're sitting around a table just sketching out together with people from industry and other stakeholders. What could we do around mobility and streets in this case? Again, same thought in your head for housing. You get all levels of politics involved as well, all levels of stakeholders. That's the Swedish Prime Minister. You're really getting a good lesson in global Prime Ministers tonight. Swedish Prime Minister on the left there, do the same thing, do design workshops with the Prime Minister. They're not very good at design workshops, to be clear, but it's about getting their engagement in it and like making it meaningful for them. But really powerfully, at the end of the day, you want the community to be leading stuff about their own neighborhood. It's their neighborhood. You know, they're the experts in this place, not the transport planner, certainly not the Prime Minister. They know very little about housing, to be frank. The people in places know entirely about places. So what we did with Stockholm was, and 4 or 5 other cities, is we let school kids redesign the streets with their schools on. They know, they go there every single day. They know they're the experts in that street. And we gave them bits of paper, as you can see. They did these beautiful workshops, took these streets, turned them into, via modular fabrication, which you'll hear about shortly, into little wooden kits that you could then begin to deploy into those streets. And then, sure enough, then 4 or 5 cities becomes 7 or 8, becomes actually now 20 different cities across Sweden, all innovating in different ways, because different places have different geographies, different cultures, different people, up and down the country. And then it finally, it spread to about 25 different cities, all of whom are actually, I know this will sound crazy, citizens are giving up their parking spaces. Because given the choice, when they said, what would you like your street to be? Blank piece of paper, most of them actually said, you know what, I'd like some more trees, please. And maybe some places to sit, or a sandpit, and something like that. Maybe we don't need as many parking spaces. If they're not given a blank piece of paper, you're immediately sort of on the back foot, and they're thinking, I'm going to protect everything I've got at all costs, because it's not genuine participation. But genuine participation means they're making it themselves, right? And when they start making it themselves, they start immediately thinking in a very, very civic, interdependent, interconnected way about something that's for the common good. We very, very rarely do that. I bet none of you have been asked, what would you like your street to be? Blank piece of paper. And you think that's pretty weird at the end of the day, because it's your street. Again, it's a public space. You're the experts in it. So the same principles, again, for housing. How would you do a mission a bit like this around housing? We Can Make has got all of the ingredients. Pretty much everything on that slide is in We Can Make's thing as well, which is why it's so interesting. We're seeing a bunch of projects around the world all beginning to do this. I think this one is by far the most progressive and interesting in the UK on this basis, because it's trying to pull all of those levers in the same way. And it's starting small in a place, which is how you do it, but then it's got the DNA to then spread beyond that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I had to keep reminding myself that I was chairing the event then, because I got so distracted by what you were saying. So I'm now going to invite up key to convening this whole event, Melissa Mean from We Can Make. Melissa has been pioneering practical ways to build homes with communities, not just for them. Aside from leading We Can Make, Melissa is also on the board of Power to Change, founding member of Mycelial, network of community asset developers working across the UK on neighbourhood scale transformations. She is director of Hood Ventures, a Black-led arts collective in Birmingham, working on land and spatial justice issues, and also commissioner on the independent Reddix Big Tent Commission on scaling delivery of affordable housing. Over to you.
Everyone can hear me, yeah? Brilliant. Very nice to be here. And thank you, Dan, for stepping in, kind of like slightly late moment. And what you were kind of like the look up moment, going like that, oh my gosh, we really are in quite a kind of like a mess. But then also identifying what some of the clues are and the ingredients about how we might respond to the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think it's also really powerful that you come here from Melbourne, and very much what we're going to be talking about tonight. This isn't just a little kind of project in Bristol. This is very much part of a real, genuinely global movement of trying to do responding in a meaningful way, and how can we begin to do housing and all sorts of other things kind of differently. So this is us. This is how we're kind of responding to these issues in Bristol. So We Can Make, we're a community land trust. And this is our mission, really. So what if? How can we imagine things differently? And crucially, to imagining things differently, it's like, how do we get power and resources into community hands? Because then we can begin to reimagine how we do housing. It's not just about delivering units, but also about building social infrastructure, community wealth, and a just transition in the process of creating those homes. And this is our neighbourhood, Knoll West, in Bristol, which I'm sure lots of you here will have been to. And it's kind of thinking, it's funny, it's, our neighbourhood was built 100 years ago nearly. And 100 years ago, our neighbourhood was seen very much as the future of housing and how we live. It was part of that wave of homes built for heroes responding to the horrors of the First World War. And I think it's our premise is that Knoll West can be the future of housing again. And in fact, it needs to be. It needs to come from neighbourhoods Knoll West. Less about kind of like brand new towns and other kind of speculative kind of futures, but finding the futures again in places like Knoll West and in neighbourhoods like Knoll West. And this is kind of counter to quite a lot of the kind of the usual kind of story we get. We often get come to kind of Knoll West because we probably had 100 years of neglect since we were built. And there's a kind of tendency that maybe we should be demolishing places like Knoll West and starting again. And we know that would just be the most colossal waste of resources. And it will be the huge waste of the know-how and talent and skills of our people, and that waste of social capital. And a colossal kind of climate crime of waste of embodied carbon as well. So we think there's a different way to tapping into the imagination and the collective intelligence of neighbourhoods like Knoll West to begin to reimagine how we can do things differently. And begin to get maybe places like this again. So housing reimagined. We very much think to do this requires that we reimagine our relationship with land, material, and each other. And I think we often kind of say that we're not actually building houses. What we're actually building is relationships. And if you look at the relationship that we've currently got with housing, it feels pretty toxic. It's very financialized. We're treated as a consumer or a customer or an investor. And it's kind of, housing is somewhere where we store wealth or we try and extract a profit from. And I think what we want to do is reimagine this relationship and reimagine housing as a right. And then if you conceive housing as a right, then that relationship is not about extraction. It's about belonging. It's about security. And it's about connection. And it's about agency. So that's what we kind of want to share tonight about how we have in Knoll West and in South Bristol, how we begin to reimagine how we do housing through these three lenses. And I'm going to share with you Multimax, which is our kind of summary of how we bring that together. And just a little, I'm going to show you a little animation. Just going to say a few thanks to people, because this is not just a We Can Make show. This is very much a collaborative effort. So working with Wall Citizen Architects, Price & Myers, Block Build, 3E, and our funders as well. So Forestry Commission, Nationwide Foundation, and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and also Bristol City Council, as creating a context where community-led innovation is welcome, and where, recognising the fact that community can often go where state or market can't go. So big thank you to all those people I know that are in the room as well, so thank you. Now I'm going to attempt, I haven't done this before, I'm going to try and play it.
The housing system is failing to deliver the decent and affordable homes we urgently need, and it's damaging our planet. What if we could create good homes in a way that didn't cost the earth? Introducing Multimax. multi-storey, maximum timber. Multi-max is a construction system for unlocking urban infill sites for affordable community-led homes. It can flex up to 4 stories and adapt to fit the tightest of sites. It also flexes to changing housing needs over time and is pre-approved for key regulations such as fire resistance and building control, making it safe, easier and less costly for communities to build the homes they need. Multi-max uses low-carbon, homegrown timber in place of high-carbon, imported materials like steel and concrete, reducing emissions. Also, multi-max homes are made locally. The parts can be digitally designed, cut and assembled in neighbourhood workshops, creating local jobs and skills. Multi-max is offered as an open resource for communities, councils and not just for profit developers. So every neighbourhood can make affordable homes that are better for people and the planet. To find out more, visit our website and download the new Multi-max playbook.
And a shout out to Ruben in the room as well, who helped. He's the animator and creative force behind that as well. Very nice. So I'm just going to explore those 3 dimensions a little bit with you as well, thinking about land, materials, and people. You'll be aware there's quite a lot of debate in the media at the moment about green belt versus grey belt. I think it's maybe a bit of a distraction because I think that still is a danger. It locks in the same kind of high carbon sprawl that we've just been used to seeing for the last kind of decades. I think a more helpful lens to look at where these homes might be able to go is thinking about well-located sites within existing neighbourhoods. And so this means you're thinking about infill and reusing buildings and using sites that are already there. And there's been some research across the whole of Europe looking at the houses that are needed. And it does show that most, if not all, of projected housing need could be accommodated within existing sites and existing infrastructure, much more kind of lower carbon than greenfield or high-rise towers. So we've been looking at this with the help from friends at Oxford Brookes University to identify all of those infill and little gaps in existing urban fabric across South Bristol. And it's quite astonishing that you, once you kind of add them up, and this is only the publicly owned sites, which is, you know, almost like 853 sites scattered across South Bristol, 49 hectares of land where homes could go, all precisely where you need them most. So we've been very lucky as part of Bristol City Council's very progressive community land disposal policy to have secured 3 sites with Black South West Network to really think about how we begin to unlock these types of sites at scale. And how we're thinking about this is like, how can we think about development as urban acupuncture rather than speculative development? So really getting exactly right where those new homes should go. And I think it's really important to think about that it's not just kind of top-down housing delivery and trying to fill all of those sites with homes, but really thinking about how any development can enhance the existing neighbourhood and the lives of people already living there, as well as any new people moving in. So yeah, home is very much more than just housing. So I think, you know, not all 853 of those sites are going to be suitable for housing, but they could be suitable for an urban forest or a play space. And thinking about that urban intensification as a way to enhance the overall quality of urban living and not just cramming in housing everywhere. So this is just to share how we've been working with one of our what we've called our site of imagination in South Bristol, which is one of the sites that we've secured. So this is in Hengrove on Rodford Mead, some of you might know it, which has been nicknamed Rodford Dreams. And so for the last year, it's kind of like a site that was plagued for kind of a decade or more of fly tipping and a real kind of like waste of space in that community and creating harm there. So we've cleared that of fly tipping, secured it, and then we've been using it as a live rehearsal space to try out what could go there instead and what would be welcome. trying out all the sorts of uses. And you can see this bit, one of the things we did, which is a very nice rule, which I think could be brought into kind of planning policy more generally in the UK, which is a Swiss planning rule called Baugesbauen, where any new development, whether it's a bathroom extension or a 20-story tower, has to put a life-size, one-to-one scale representation of what's going to come there before. So we got some of the best scaffolders in South Bristol to come and make a 4-story tower, a bit guerrilla style, I have to say. We didn't ask anyone's permission to do this, but just to kind of like pop up and see what development could look like there. And I think it's kind of fascinating, like usually kind of conversations about what development is, would be welcome in an area, in a dusty kind of town hall. We just kind of spent, oh no, that's too high, that's not welcome. But because we're able to create this as a rehearsal space, trying out, prototyping different uses with the community, the conversation switched to be about, can we go higher? We've got so many ideas we want to fit in here. And so over the kind of year, we've been co-designing with our community, thinking about what might be possible here. And then just, I think, on Friday, this is the planning application that's gone in and gone live. So if anyone has time to go on the planning portal and maybe leave a supportive comment, that'd be very welcome. But it just begins to show how these sites can be turned into something really possible. Not just homes, but also it's got social infrastructure, community use at the ground floor with the community kitchen and community event space, and then apartments above it. A second lens we're looking through is materials. And I think it's kind of like, there's some really kind of nuts kind of like stats around materials once you begin to kind of look at it. Dan kind of mentioned earlier that if we just continue to build in the way that we are at the moment, then housing is going to use up our whole carbon budget well before 2050. And I think it's kind of like, it's also, you mix that as well with the UK has currently got a £14 billion trade deficit of construction materials each year of what it's importing. Again, it's kind of nuts. And then you kind of discover the UK imports the most timber, a second only to China in the world, and then burns most of it for fuel. Just like all that carbon gone up in smoke, and it's just nuts. So it's kind of like we radically need to rethink how we stop this wastage of materials and begin to build in a different way. So we've been very much thinking about how you use local materials, biomaterials, and thinking about embodied carbon, about how you can build in a different way. So the main ingredients in Multimax is OSB, which is a type of material that's made from the waste byproduct from the forestry industry. So the thinnings, the toppings of trees, is turned into a structural material. So this is quite transformational, taking essentially a waste product and then turning it into a product, structural product that you can then build whole buildings with. And then we've got a cassette-based system, which kind of fits together a bit like Lego. And the great thing about this is that it's a small enough product that you can actually make in local factories. So this is our factory in Null West. And what's great is having this as is at a scale that can, just finding my right bit of paper. So what's great about this is you don't need a crazy amount of equipment to set this up. This is kind of reasonable kind of amount of kit that a neighbourhood can get hold of itself. So this is our CNC machine here in the middle, that's where we make the cassettes. And you can see our crew of local people, trades, that can be trained up and to be able to fabricate and make these homes, all to the highest quality standards. So we've tried out lots of different kind of systems with our community, and the system we use is block build, shout out in the audience there, which our community members really liked working with because it's simple to put together and really high quality precision kind of standards. And I think what's really exciting about this way of building is kind of creates that new vernacular, localized bioregional way to build. So the main ingredient, that OSB material, great, it's a homegrown resource that we can kind of source from the UK. And then this can be mixed with other local biomaterial resources, or sourced again from the region, from foundations to final fit out. So we defined our bioregion as the 100 miles from around Null West. And we really looked at the type of trees that grow locally and what they can be used for. And you can see here in the kind of like the photographs here, this is us working with a local sustainable forest to source the cladding for our next homes using cypress timber, which grows pretty quickly, 20 years, and then being turned into cladding panels, and then that's that thinned out forest afterwards. Much more, it's more sustainable and really looked after, well looked after forest. And I think, you know, this is one of the most powerful kind of things about kind of building in this way. We've been able to take a group of our future residents who are going to be living in the homes to go to the forest and meet the trees that are going to be forming part of the homes that they're going to live in, and then plant the next set of trees that are going to replace them. And this is kind of the connection between, you know, material understanding of the land and the trees that homes come from. It's just kind of transformatory in terms of creating a different kind of connection with people. And it makes a really good news story, both embodied and operational carbon, and how the homes work. And so you can dig into the details there in the report. And then the third lens, like kind of looking and thinking about our relationship and how we do housing, is around people. So Multimax is all about how do we take a relational and collaborative approach to creating and maintaining the good homes that we need. And so this applies both to the hardware of the structure of the homes themselves and also the software of how we operate those buildings as well. So it really is a priority of how do we design in opportunities for connection and long-view stewardship that really centres people's safety, agency, and sense of belonging. So on the hardware kind of side of things, as the little kind of film showed, it's really easy to flex the system between 1 and 3 bedrooms, so it can really adapt to people's changing needs over time. And it's really, we built it so that you can also integrate not just housing, but social infrastructure at ground floor level, so much more than just housing. And in terms of the software, we're building for 100% social rent in the homes that we're doing. And we developed a devolved co-op model, whereby we can make, as a community land trust, we keep hold of the land and the building, so we can then recycle the value of that for investing in the next set of homes that we're building. But then we have a co-op for the people living within the homes, so they can take on agency in terms of how the homes themselves are run. So this is a much more kind of empowering way to deliver housing. And I think what's really special about having us as a kind of community land trust holding this kind of long relationship, like we're there straight from the very kind of like co-design of what those homes might be, through sourcing the materials, training local people to build those homes, designing how those homes are going to be managed and run for the long term. Then that's like a whole long view stewardship relationship that we're building in. These are not just transactional kind of consumer products that are being traded for profit. We think that's really powerful. So we're very much recognizing that, you know, we can make it just one small kind of neighborhood experiment. But we do hope that by working in this way as a prototype, a working prototype, working with real sites, real people, the real systems and limitations, we can be a bit of a prototype, a little pocket of the future in the present that we can learn from. And very much, we're offering Multimax as an open source system for other communities to use, councils, cooperatives, not just for profit developers. It's there to adapt and adopt for their own areas. And we're definitely not pretending that we are the only answer or that we have all of the answers. And we're very much aware, as kind of Dan was talking earlier, that Multimax is part of a wider movement of how do we do housing differently and within planetary boundaries. So the kind of question is like, how do we begin to kind of shift what We Can Make It is doing from the very, and others like us, from the margins to the mainstream of how we do housing in the UK. And so what we talk about in the report is how do we have a new kind of mission for how we do housing. And we're calling this a new Great British Housing Mission. And we think this can be a kind of like a mobilizing kind of North Star. Try to get some kind of purpose behind, you know, it can be, you know, the 1.5 million housing target is, it's only really talking about quantity and speed and not actually how we need to live. And so we think that these are the shifts that can give some kind of mobilizing purpose behind those kind of targets. So I'm not going to go through all of those shifts now, but maybe just kind of pulling out two that seem really important. I think one is around how do we move from a £14 billion trade deficit in construction materials? And then what we want to move to is how do we become a nation of growers, producers, and makers using homegrown materials and reused materials to build the good homes that we need that can store carbon rather than emit it. And I think the other kind of critical one is like the obsession of talking just about units delivered. It's soulless, isn't it? So how do we talk about becoming a nation of neighbours, where we use how we design new homes and the retrofit of existing homes to really build in connection and stewardship between people. And I think those are the powerful things that we can do. And then the report thinking about what are the practical things that we can begin to think about how we make those shifts. And so there's nine points, leverage points for change. And this isn't about a kind of like a bottom-up rebellion or trying to rely on a top-down kind of solution from on high. In this kind of system change, this kind of shift that we're working for, it does require everyone, whether it's from a home, street, neighbourhood, council, metro authority, bioregion, national and beyond, working together and trying things out and beginning to put these shifts into action. So thinking about things like, can we get a set of kind of common good land bank? Can we invest in 100 factories across the UK? Can we begin to regulate embodied carbon? All these shifts can begin to work at all of those kind of layers. And I'm just going to highlight one of the practical kind of leverage points that we talk about in the report. When we were putting this together, we spotted that the Canadian government had also put out something as well, which we felt quite akin to in what they were doing. We think we've got like a bit of a whole stack approach about how we could do housing differently, from the spatial retrofit of homes up to 4-storey apartment blocks. And we could see that the Canadian government had done something kind of similar in that it's put out a new housing design catalogue where it has put out 50 designs. Each of those attuned to a particular region within Canada, thinking about the very particular materials that are available there, and then matching that with infill opportunities within existing neighbourhoods. And so I think if it's kind of good enough for Canada, then maybe it can be good enough for Bristol and the West. And that's what the offer is really for us. So yeah, read the report, download, get in touch. There's a whole load of actions we'll come back to later. And then one of the things that we're kind of just wanting to highlight, as well as making positive comments on the planning application, would be very helpful. But we've set up a small fund for other community-led organisations that are exploring housing. And we think we can support 7, maybe a bit more, organisations if they want to explore how they might be able to use Multimax in their own neighbourhoods. So get in touch, click on the link, and yeah. And we can act together, we can grow this movement for the kind of change and the kind of homes that we need. Thank you.
You can really see the centrality of relationships and people, I think, in everything that Melissa was talking about. And one of the things that I explore in my research is how we often treat housing as this neutral good. It's about it's about units, and it's about numbers, and it's about delivery. But in South Africa, where my research is based, and in the UK, the housing system reflects far deeper choices, right? About who belongs, who leads, who benefits from the growth, etc. And that's why conversations like this and everything that Melissa and others have been talking about are so important. You know, how we measure how many homes are built, but not how many people live in them, or how people live in them, how they relate to each other, whether they feel safe, stable, whether they feel seen. And these are metrics of justice, and we need to build them into how we build our homes. What happens when communities aren't just consulted, but are actually co-leading housing processes, bringing in their own values and their own knowledge and their own networks. What we see is a shift from building houses to building capability, to building solidarity, and place-based dignity. And that shift is seen is just as relevant here in Bristol as it is in the townships that I research in Cape Town. So anyway, I just wanted to plug that little bit in there. So to help us understand what it means to build homes that are low carbon and high dignity, I'm going to hand over to Dave Lomax from Woe Thistleton Architects, who brings decades of experience in designing with mass timber and thinking differently about materials and process. Dave is an associate director, the world's leading architects in mass timber, shortlisted for the Reba Sterling Prize in 2018. He was the lead architect on the world's largest CLT building at the time, Dalston Works, and the black and white building, the tallest all-timber office in central London. He's also chair of Southwark Design Review Panel.
Hello there, hope you can all hear me okay. I'm going to be glasses on, glasses off so I can see you and see this. But I suppose I'm here to do the technical bit, but don't worry, I'm going to keep you away from vapor control layers and foundations. I'm actually instead going to try and tell you a little bit about why we go about our work in the way that we do and how that way of going about our work coincides with the exciting opportunity we've had with the team at We Can Make. Yes, so what we do as a practice really is focus on mass timber. I'll tell you what that particular connection of words means in a second. But I think it's really important to say that where we started as a practice was thinking about really high quality architecture, but working out how that could be inherently sustainable. So eschewing this kind of idea that to be sustainable, it has to look sustainable. You have to have a jumper with holes in it. You have to have mice running in and out of hay bales. You have to have a whirligig on the roof. Well, we thought maybe actually what we all need is one slightly better jumper that doesn't have any holes in it. Maybe we can have a great jumper and do it that way. So the start of the journey really was sustainability. The way that we realized we could deliver that kind of change at the kind of scale that we need to act was thinking about the way that our buildings were made, what we made them out of. You've heard some amazing stats from Dan about what we make our buildings out of now and why that is toxic. But what we also realized was, surprisingly enough, building out of an incredibly old material like wood wasn't actually as easy as perhaps we thought it might be. We thought maybe everybody kind of had got their head around those sorts of things already. But what we realized was that we needed to generate a lot of new knowledge. So what's up on the screen here is, I guess, the process of how we go about work in our practice, which is slightly different to some others. On the left is some images that aren't about me showing off. It's just so that you know I'm not making it up. You know, we do really high quality, beautiful places for people to live and work. But what we also do is we generate new knowledge. About a third of our practice works wholly on research. And we try and make sure that's the kind of research that is peer-reviewed, funded, working with other experts and specialists, rather than maybe making a nice picture of our living room and thinking we've redesigned co-working. But what's really, really important to us is, as about 30 people in East London, to make the scale of change we think is important, we can't do that by doing all those projects ourselves and carving off that knowledge and sitting on it. So what we do is we share. And an interesting document on the right is one of our very first pieces of research around 100 different mass timber buildings in the UK, which is actually funded by the Binational Softwood Lumber Association of Canada and the US to try and build an evidence base for changing building codes. So it started to show us that developing knowledge was going to be as important as developing buildings, and sharing that knowledge was critical. So why do we think we should build in wood? Well, we've had lots of eloquent explanations of why that might be a good idea from lots of different points of view, but an illustrative stat is to think about the homes that we build today out of concrete in sort of mid and tall rise buildings. Now generally, when we build one flat within a block of flats, that causes the emission of about 20 tons of carbon to build that home. So those carbon is emitted before we've started turning on the oven or A-rated appliances, all those sorts of things. And taking out high carbon materials like concrete and replacing them with low carbon materials like wood is fundamentally a good thing in that point of view. We reduce the amount of carbon we use to make our buildings. But what's really important to us is also, where is the carbon going that those trees have absorbed within their life? So most of the trees that we use for this are commercially forested trees. Most of our forests in Europe are commercial forests. That means they're getting cut down whether we like it or not. So one of our biggest decisions is, where does that wood go? Does it go into low quality materials that very quickly end up in biofuel or in short duration lifespan places? Or can we put that material into an urban forest, into a carbon sink made of our cities and store it for 60, 80, 100 years while we regrow 3 trees in place of that original tree? And that's a little of what this diagram talks about, and we think that there's on average about 19 kilograms of carbon stored in a mid-rise apartment building. So we're not talking about taking out 20 tons of carbon that could have been emitted, we're talking about a swing of nearly 40 tons. But what we realized quite quickly is that concrete and timber, steel, they're not similar in the way that they work. Timber is not something that you can simply pour into a shape in order to deliver the structural requirements, the processes that you might want to achieve. We have to start to think already about wood as a system or an ecosystem, as a diverse range of different sorts of materials, and also a diverse range of places from which we source these materials, as well as places to which it's realistic that they will go. So on the left, I won't dwell too much on mass timber today because that's not what we're talking about, but on the left are components made out of multiple pieces of sawn lumber glued together in high-grade presses to make really big, durable buildings. Now that's great if we're building 9, 10 stories, and we'll put those into the kind of scenarios where they might last for, certainly multiples of decades, hopefully even multiples of centuries. But at the far other side of this diagram are the offcuts from that process, the thinning that Melissa was talking about, all those small, tiny little bits. And most of those materials go very quickly into either landfill or into fuel sources. So the carbon in those materials very quickly goes back to the environment. So can we think differently about how we use those? Now, typically, the appropriate material for the products on the left tends in the UK to come from Austria, to come from Germany. Actually, the materials we make in the UK tend to find themselves in those notionally lower quality materials, the thing that make banquet seating for restaurants that last the first 6 months and then go bust if you're not too lucky. So what we started to do in some of our research was to start to codify this and share it, to start to tell people how to use these different types of materials in different situations. This was produced with the Timber Trade Body for the UK and actually to support the London Mayor in writing better policy, because we were finding that politicians didn't know how to describe this sort of material. They didn't know the difference between the things that we might make our kind of sprawling Berkeley Homes estate from compared to the 10-story, even taller buildings that we were talking about in mass timber. And of course, once we start to talk about systems, what we can do is start to tell people how to use those systems dimensionally. So one of the big things about designing in systems is this is a great way to share our competence, to share our knowledge, and to empower people with less competence, a loaded word, but a really important one in the current context, to share that competence not just with designers, but with other stakeholders, to say, right, here's how you can start. Because if you start with a diagram like that, it's a little bit scary. If you start with a diagram like this, with typical dimensions, typical ideas of how you can start to design your homes, your offices, then that gives us a really good way in for people to start to implement this really important way of designing. Now, a lot of people's reaction is, well, hold on, if we start to design things as systems, doesn't that mean we have to all have the same things? And haven't we been here before? Doesn't it look a little bit like this? Well, first bit of whizzy PowerPoint, no. I don't believe that's the case. But a lot of people have used lots of analogies to try and convince us that this doesn't need to be the case. And I think some of those analogies are used poorly. So lots of times in our industry, when we talk about modern methods of construction, we talk about building things away from the traditional building site, people talk about the vehicle industry. They talk about the way we make cars. Now, actually, a lot of the time, that seems to dovetail with this kind of way of designing. You make one thing, you make it really well, you make it repeatedly. Lots of factories we've had to try and build homes as big boxes have failed because they simply can't find enough customers for their one box. But the analogy I would rather use, and one that fits better with what we're talking about today, is actually the way that car factories work. And the way I like to talk about it is, when we systemize, when we try to make things into processes, not products, what we're trying to do is work out the correct resolution. And I'm talking not in terms of completeness, I'm talking in terms of a pixel on a computer screen. What is the resolution at which we should be standardizing things? This is a Mitsubishi component. It's a chassis. It's very low res. So there you go. The pixel analogy is there already. But what maybe people won't realize is most car factories don't make very many other things other than cars. They don't make steering wheels. They don't make dashboards. They don't make doors. They assemble those things into their version of what a car looks like. So actually, that same platform is exactly the same. I'm sorry to tell you, if you like to do donuts in your Mitsubishi Lancer, you are in fact driving a Jeep Compass, which is a resolutely family car, because that component, designed at the correct resolution, supports all of this diversity of products. So it's really about thinking about processes that we can repeat, not products. And actually, that can very simply apply to the way that we design our homes. Now, we've done lots of systemized design processes. We've done them for big buildings, little buildings, homes, offices. It's really important that when we design systems, we properly understand their parameters. So here, working with We Can Make and the study that they've done, we understand really carefully what our parameters are. We know that this is for infill housing. It's not 10 stories. It's not 300 homes in one go. We know that it's for particular types of sites, so we have a good idea of how we might deliver those. We know that we want to use locally sourced materials, so we can start to choose from that ecosystem of products. We also know that actually pretty much good homes are made pretty much of the same things, and they're pretty much the same sizes. Perhaps they're slightly bigger in Australia, but you know, we can keep a grip on that. But our policy in the UK already tells us about what sizes our homes are. So we're starting to build this picture. So I suppose the next thing is to think about what is the analogy for our platform or our chassis. And you know, lots already said about the brilliant opportunities of working with block build, but this really does give us some ideas of what those starting dimensions are. Those starting dimensions are based on the ability of communities with regular skills to be able to put them together and handle them. Lots that we can talk about here, but I think two things that maybe aren't directly on the slide as you maybe pick over some of what's in there are, what really appeals to us is it's another extension of this idea of how do we extend our competence and our knowledge, and how do we extend an ability to deliver quality into an area where people don't have those same competencies. So how do we empower communities to build really well? Well, that's by taking the right parts of this process, only the platform, into factories, building them off-site, but delivering them in a way where you can hang a picture on the wall. You can ask your plumber to come and fix the pipe in the ceiling without going and doing kind of magical calculations and all those sorts of things. And the last and most important part is, of course, this particular system makes incredibly good use of those lowest quality components, that OSB, those shredded bits of wood that we produce en masse in the UK that normally we very quickly allow to go back into the environment. So we're thinking about how we can put those into our most durable assets. So it gets a little bit techie here. I'm going to go far too quick for anybody to really retain any of this, but that's what the documents are for, so maybe I'm driving you toward that download link at the end. But there are a few different scales at which we standardize. So we start to think about how we deliver the stability structurally of these buildings. We start to think about how we can have flexibility to design on different types of building sites. Buckle in, another bit of whizzy stuff. There we go, just so you can see the moving parts and the simple parts. But there are good correlations between the things that we use that require the most technical expertise, mostly the wet stuff. So that's pipes, wires, kitchens, ventilation, WCs, and that all sits in a bit that we carefully design in the factory, and that gives us our structural stability. But by using the innate flexibility of block build and cassette type systems, we know that we can make the next bits, the sort of archways, flex and stretch to deliver any kind of layouts that we might want. And what that quite quickly allows us to do is to identify something that, again, we can inject this sort of competence, this opportunity into community designers and community planners. Yes, this will not deliver every geometry of home that you might want, but it will deliver everything we think you need to get started on this journey of building on exactly these kinds of sites that could play such an incredible part in solving our housing crisis, but also doing that in a low carbon way. So on the left, you can see that the typical sizes of block build components that we think will deliver sort of 80% of the homes that one might desire to build. You can see then those are color coded. And when we zoom into this gives us a different scale of how we deliver that competency, if you like. So each of those color codings is talking about performance. They're all still made in the same places, but if we know that we design within a process that has been defined, that we have reviewed with building control experts, that we have had fire tested, then actually we don't need to be redesigning all of these little bits of houses every time. I can tell you now, I'm sure there are one or two architects in the audience. How many times have you redrawn the details out of the white book? Why do we need to keep doing that? Actually, all those partitions, the performance is defined, and there is a process in which we can use this. And this goes all the way to checklists to tell people how to check that work has been done on site. So again, we're delivering through process, through our expertise, through our teams and block builds expertise, that into the community. So it's important to kind of zoom back out and test that that thing is doing what we hope that thing is doing. So a couple of ways to look at it. Now what I'm talking about is the idea that through the block build system, we have a standardization at a large scale. We have an organizational principle, which is standard. We have standardization at a small scale, which is these individual moments of connection, these individual moments of assemblies that are well within the skill of an ordinary contractor. And by standardizing at both those scales, actually, we can make any image that we want to. And we know that because that's how it works in other situations. So by combining the macro scale of the block build components that we have defined for you, by combining that with the small scale, we go back to that diagram. Now to test this, of course, working with We Can Make and Bristol City Council, we have a series of plots of land that we're starting to think about. So we've, research, systems, design, products, these are iterative loops. You don't simply design, build, and walk away and never think about it again. So that process has been done to start to look at actually a different design here for Robertsmead, which is one of the very first organisations we tested, looking at how we can mix different home types, create diversity of communities, create flexibility during the life of that building within set parameters. But also, we have to acknowledge the realities of designing buildings. There are stakeholders that aren't close to the process that we have to engage with. We have planners, we have cost consultants, we have all of those people who might give us bright ideas as to how our buildings might be better through their lens. This is actually a much older version of the Robertsmead design, which shows still the core elements of that, but taking feedback from the planners and from other stakeholders, we're able to demonstrate and test the details that we provide for you in such a way that we know we can respond to people's comments. There is no point having this inert product which can only deliver house type 1, 2, and 3. What we have is a process that can deliver to all of those things. And I won't dwell on these for too long because Melissa's already shown you the beautiful drawings of these buildings. But if we look at them through this new lens of the complexity available within what is in fact a really very simple system, you can see that these are not those Soviet-era repetitive boxes stacked on top of each other. They don't need to be that with a little imagination and with the gift, I guess, of our knowledge in the details that we have. So I'm not the foggiest, whether I spoke to time or not, but I am done, so you're free of me now. But just worth saying, if you do have interest in other types of timber building, all of the research we publish, as far as we're allowed, goes onto our website. So please do, if the wider topic of building in wood and in low carbon ways is interesting, have a little look at the research on our website. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Louise Davidson, Head of Housing Delivery at Bristol City Council. Louise plays a crucial role in shaping how the city responds to the housing crisis, and I've also been reliably informed that she is a horsewoman. So when it comes to steering housing policy, it's fair to say she knows how to handle the reins. I had to chuck that in there, sorry. I apologize.
Thank you. So, what also wasn't said is I am a very last-minute sub. This slot was supposed to be taken up by Councillor Barry Parsons, who's our chair of our Housing and our Homes and Housing Delivery Committee, and unfortunately he's been taken ill at the very last minute. So instead of a lovely presentation, I have notes that I wrote in 15 minutes. And it also feels a bit strange because I want to lift you back up to the macro level. We've been talking very detailed here about some very small sites and some very local issues. But I think what I want to just really remind us all about is Bristol and our housing crisis. But before that, just a little bit about me. Yes, I am a horsewoman for my sins. I'm also head of housing delivery here at the City Council, and that means within sort of the portfolio of work that I cover, it's our direct council house building programme. And oh my God, am I familiar with how you build small sites. In fact, my career over sort of working with RPs has also been around that. I have our strategy and enabling team, working with all of our third-party providers, including our community-led housing sector, working with developers. So everything we do is looking at that absolute macro level right down to what we do on really, really tiny scale with small providers. And then the third strand of what we do in housing delivery, and Tim is here in the meeting with us today, is our sort of local area regeneration work. So working in Philwood, in Southmead, in places like Localising, working with the community to find solutions to housing challenges and other problems. So we've got quite a breadth of what we do across the city. But it all comes down to this. Bristol is a city in housing crisis. We know that. That's why we're all here today. We've got over 22,000 households on our Home Choice Housing Register. And around half of those are in our Band 4. So those are people who need a home but probably haven't a realistic chance of actually getting an allocated home from either the council or one of our RP partners. We have nearly 1,700 households in temporary accommodation in the city. That is a real challenge, both for us as a city from a cost point of view, but for those households and those individuals. And I know we said we're not going to talk about numbers, but numbers in our game means people and households. So every time I talk about a home or a unit delivered, and I will quote some numbers in a minute, those all make a difference to an individual who is housed. So I'm not going to apologise, Melissa, I am going to be talking about numbers and delivery, because it is really important. We have a wider housing need that isn't reflected through Home Choice. And that's the housing need in the city of that intermediate housing group. Those people who are working but aren't earning enough to meet their housing need in the market, but also aren't earning little enough to sit on a housing register. And that is a kind of forgotten sector in the city. So yes, we're really, really keen, and a priority for us is delivering social rented homes. But actually we've got this huge chunk of the city that need an affordable place to live, whether that's through an intermediate product or through affordable home ownership, for example. And I don't think when we're talking about any of this housing delivery, we can lose sight of that cohort in the city. Now, the City Council has made a really positive stand about affordable housing delivery, both in the Affordable Housing Delivery Plan we adopted in February of this year, but also in the very newly adopted corporate strategy, where I think for many years, we actually have a key priority for the city. And the plan, actually, the strategy turns around and says we will aim to create safe and healthy neighbourhoods and affordable, safe, good quality homes. And within that, our priorities will be about the safety and quality of our own council homes, working with partners to deliver affordable housing to meet community needs. And then there's a third one that's not as directed to the work I do, but it's around creating safe spaces, safe open spaces and safe communities. So I think from our absolute top level, we are working in an area where the City Council is absolutely committed to addressing some of this challenge. Now, this is the numbers bit, because I'm actually really proud of what we are doing already in the city about affordable housing delivery, and in an environment that's actually really quite hard to build in. So last year, we did see the delivery of 535 new affordable homes, and that was from a wide range of partners. That was our own council house building programme, our RPs, specialist housing providers, our own housing company, Gorham Homes, so a huge selection of providers out there. And really, really excitingly, we actually started 555 new homes on site in that same time from a similar makeup of organisations. So I think what we're seeing in the city is the role for anybody, any organisation, any provider who is stepping up and going, we can help make a difference to deliver homes in the city, whether that is the community-led housing sector, whether it's RRPs, whether it is developers, because actually we do still need our development sector, even some of the big guys that, you know, sometimes we struggle with. They have to be there and part of the solution for the city. Now, I'm very proud particularly of our own HRA programme, and it has to be said our council house programme is really ramped up in the last couple of years. So at the moment, I've got 533 affordable homes on site, another couple of sites equaling 41 homes about to go into development, and some small sites in planning. So we are, as a local authority, directly getting involved in delivering homes. The majority of those are for social rent, but more broadly in the city, we've got over 1,700 homes on site being built by our providers and ourselves and our partners, and a pipeline of nearly 2,000 affordable homes. So that's a really exciting place for us to be. But we know it's not enough. We know that is barely tickling the surface, and that's why the work that we've talked about today around small sites is actually so important. We are a constrained city. We know that there isn't the land out there to build at scale. You know, when we talk about large developments across the country, people are talking homes of 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 homes. We have very few sites in the city that can deliver that. And that means the work we do to identify smaller sites is absolutely vital. But we also know that those small sites are really, really hard to deliver. They are actually disproportionately expensive to deliver. And we know that the community-led housing sector in particular is really struggling with that. So, Melissa, really, really keen to understand more about the work you're talking about doing around how the Multi-Max programme can support some of our other community-led housing providers. Because I do see that that's one way we can actually get that whole sector moving in the city, because we know that they're really struggling. I'm not going to talk about challenges of big sites. We know that the city is really, really difficult to build. But one of the things that we are recognising, and actually now national government is recognising, is that role of small sites. And a quick plug for a work stream that we're very excited about. So you might have seen in the press just recently that MHCLG has announced something called the National Small Sites Aggregator Pilot. And that's working with Bristol City Council, Lewisham Council and Sheffield, with Lloyd's Banking Group, with MHCLG funding and private investors, to also look to how we unlock small sites across the city, aggregate them to create economies of scale, and to pitch in with that early pre-planning work, which is an area that is really, really expensive. And like, again, Melissa, we need to talk, because like the work you've done around identifying small sites, we've also had some work along that being done with Atkins Realis, as you're aware. So we need to get together and make sure that we're not all duplicating effort. I think there's a lot we can learn from all the different work streams we're doing around small sites. And I think just to finish up then, the other really exciting stuff in the city, all around small sites delivery, because everything really is focusing on that smaller scale stuff. What do we do with land that has a meanwhile use? So we're doing some really exciting work around putting homes on sites that we might need for something else in 10 years' time. But actually, in the meantime, let's use it for housing. We're doing lots of work around our specialist and supported housing, sort of homes for people who have a really complex need, but where we're not delivering enough for them in the city. Work around our temporary accommodation priorities. And even actually a new piece of work we're looking at is work around our van dwelling communities, which obviously we've all seen in the city as a real challenge for us. So I think as long as we're all working together around this, there's a place absolutely for Multi-Max and for our community-led housing organisations. And it's really impressive to see what's being done here. But let's see that as a part of a much bigger housing solution for the city to meet the crisis we're in. That was very, very quick. But anyway.
Okay, so there was meant to be another panelist. Oh, hi. Okay, scrap that. Right, so finally, we have Indy Jahan. Indy is from Dark Matter Labs, who will help us understand the bigger picture, I hope. The systems beneath the systems, if you will. So Indy is an architect and co-founder, as I said, of Dark Matter Labs, a field laboratory focused on building the institutional infrastructures for radical civic societies, cities, regions, and towns. Dark matter analyzes the shifts required in the underlying dark matter, monetary, economic, governance, regulatory, and policy systems to manifest transformations in our food, housing, land, material, and nature systems towards a future of mutual thriving. Indy's works reminds us that transformation must begin with the invisible rules, the governance, the finance, and policies that shape what is possible.
Hi, sincere apologies for being late. Trains and heat and everything else. I'm going to be relatively sharp and hopefully relatively precise. I think the problem and the challenge I think we should be tackling with is how many homes do you think the UK can afford to build if it was to live within the Paris Accord? All of the UK. It's about 14,000 homes if we don't do any retrofit a year. But if we do retrofit, we don't even have 14,000 homes. And I think one of my challenges right now is that when we start to look at the systemic constraints, and it's not just carbon. You can use carbon. You could say we're going to blow our carbon budget because of whatever. You could talk about labor. Well, actually, I don't mean the political party. I mean the kind of labor force. But the reality is that most of our labor force has been redirected towards defense and infrastructure. It's very difficult to even get the labor in many of the sites that we're talking about. If you then look at the material base, actually there's real fundamental questions about the material base. Every city we work with talks about how they're going to electrify themselves and be fully electric, and then you say, well, where's the copper? There is enough copper in the world, no doubt. But actually the copper mines and the copper wire, there is increasingly systemic shortages of. We're unlikely to be able to electrify a lot of our cities that we talk about. So, and everyone then, you know, good architects always turn up and say, but India built a timber house. I think that's fantastic. And where do you think the timber came from? Because it didn't come from the UK. Because we know there isn't a structurally managed timber forest in the UK. Right? Most of our timber is used for pulp. And that's how we've been gearing it and building it. So when you start to look at the underlying problem, you very quickly unwinds from the politics that we talk about. And then it opens up some really serious questions. And I want to sort of, the hard questions, right? So if you look at my shirt, what, is a 45-pound shirt. I don't wear expensive shirts. It's about 10 years old, just so you know. How much do you think it would cost if you were to really price social, environmental, ecological costs? Cost about 250 to 450 pounds. 250 to 450 pounds. Now take a house. Price in social, environmental costs. How much do you think that house costs? And I think, and I know what I'm saying is politically not palatable, because I think we're stuck into a narrative of fixing desire problems from the late 20th century, which is we all deserve semi-detached two-bedroom homes, and somehow this is the utopia that we should be living in. I think there is a fundamental problem coming to us, whether we like it or not, whether we're nice about it or not, but the fundamentals don't just work. And we're still fulfilling 19th century or late 20th century desires. You know, replacing a house with kind of putting some photovoltaics on it and saying, okay, well, we've got a low energy house. Unfortunately, the fundamentals aren't working in our favor. And that's going to require us to think much more innovatively about how we respond to the social justice issues in our housing stock. So if you look at per square meter, and Australia, I hope Dan probably beautifully explained it, per person in Australia, the kind of number of space occupied per person is massively bloated. So what does spatial justice really look like when a 4-bedroom house has been lived in by 2.5 people? What is spatial justice? And I think we're going to have to look much more seriously about how we look at our existing housing stock. We're going to have to look much more seriously about how we retrofit, and even that is not, material retrofit's really not on the table. I know a lot of architects, as I trained as an architect, I'd love to sort of talk about full material retrofit. We just don't have the carbon budget left for full material retrofit. And even energy retrofits are actually quite difficult if you look at the transaction costs of doing energy retrofits in a detailed sense. So I do think there's a kind of hard question in this problem. And the hard question is, how do we actually build environments for people to sustain? And how do we build environments that unfurl the full quality of people in a deeper sense? And we know the environmental justice issues, right? Indoor air quality is 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. We know actually our indoor environments are pretty poor fundamentally, right? We know actually all sorts of factors in terms of if you're living with a noisy house, if you live on a noisy road, well, you lose about 2 years of your life, because micro stress levels impacts actually your sleep patterns, and that has significant impact on how your longitudinal stress hormones in your body, and that takes off years, makes you more prone to diabetes and other issues. So we know vast amounts of stuff about the level of violence that's going on in our built environment passively. And yet we also know the constraints. And unfortunately, I don't think the solution is I'm going to build you some houses. That's the hard. I don't know. If someone's got a magic bullet, and the only magic bullet I know of right now is carbon sequestration, which the UK government has planted about 20 billion into to basically suck some carbon out some air and store it. We don't know. It's non-proven technology. We don't know if that's going to work. We don't know the energy requirements of it. But if we're going to deal with this, well, I think stuff like what Melissa's doing, We Can Make is doing, is absolutely brilliant. Take existing stock, expand it. Make our streets intergenerational, because we're going to have to deal with a care crisis, not just a housing crisis. Take homes, you know, one of the things we were talking about, how do you take a private home and sell it to community? Sell it to a public trust? Can we reframe our housing stock in a different way? Build shared infrastructure at street level. So if you're going to build anything, build shared infrastructure on street levels to allow homes to be intergenerational. Because if we don't solve our care crisis, we don't actually solve our housing crisis. So I think there's a whole retrofit of our historic buildings, which we're not going to be able to do nicely, but we are going to have to re-inhabit. We can do 600,000 homes into our historic buildings. That's what the number shows. Into our existing historic buildings. We're going to have to do that very quickly and in really smart ways. And that's going to be completely different technologies, like fabrics and other things, insulated fabrics. We're going to have to think radically differently about how we choose to live. And all of this is going to require a different way of accommodating the price. So if my shirt is 250 to 450 pounds, think what a house is. Construction cost of a house, what? Right now, 300,000, 250,000, somewhere between that, 2-bedroom or whatever. So now put in a five time factorial on that. You're talking the real cost of the materials of a house, probably put it at about $1 million. That's not about private ownership anymore, and it's certainly not about private rent, which is the other way we're told this. I think we're going to have to talk about new forms of in-public stewardship of housing stock, which is being held in perpetuity in a new mineral economy. So if you own a timber house, right? So everyone goes to me about, tell me whenever I need to stop ranting. So if you own a timber house, you need to sequester that timber for 500 years. You need to hold that timber for 500 years, right? If you're not holding that timber in 500 years and you're releasing it, frankly, it's no good to anyone. So you own the liabilities of those minerals and materials economies. You don't just own its release, you own the liabilities and stewarding those mineral economies. We're going to have to rebuild our mineral economy in fundamental ways. And that's not like, I'm not saying anything that's to say, oh my God, it's a disaster. I think we can build an amazing city out of this, but it just needs a different set of solutions and a different way of looking at the problem, and it requires us to work and live differently. And we have to just get ourselves out of trying to fulfill ourselves with effectively late 20th century desires of an electric car versus a petrol car. It's not going to get us home. Semi-detached house with a kind of photovoltaic house doesn't get us home. We just don't have the mineral economies for it anymore. We don't have the material base from it. So we need a different way of living. And I think it could be way better for us if we're actually diligent about it and we build the financial mechanisms and the contractual mechanisms to govern them, as opposed to just thinking about public and private economies. And I think there are options available into that framework. And I think the work that Dan and Melissa, and I'm sure all of you are doing, starts to sit into that. But I just wanted to share maybe some of that frame, and I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. While the panelists, if I could just ask you to take your seats, while they're doing that, I'm just going to ask you if I could invite everyone to perhaps just turn to the person next to you. Ideally, the person next to you that you don't already know, if that exists. And just take a moment just to share what's resonating most with you so far, and what hopes or ideas are you taking forward, just while they're getting themselves settled. Please go ahead. Okay. Thank you, everyone. If I could just bring you all back. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to go into Q&A with the panelists here, just for the next sort of 10 minutes or so, whatever we have left. But I'm just going to kick us off very quickly before you all get started. If I could just maybe, as chair, I feel like I have a little, maybe a little extra something. Right, so I'm just going to, if I could just pose a question to Louise, if that's okay. So the Bristol City Council has taken a pioneering role in the land disposal policy for community-led housing. I just wondered what role you see for councils in creating the conditions for this to scale, or perhaps, as proposed in the report, to set up a common land bank to get land and homes out of the financialised market.
So I think that is actually going to come down to what happens at a national level, because what we're seeing is we set up the land disposal work and all the engagement with our community-led housing providers at a time when they were funded organisations. So the challenge we've got at the moment is we have land that is allocated with organisations that have no funding to make them happen. And I think our key priority is actually seeing those organisations succeed and understanding how that's worked, almost before we can go on and say, what else can we do? So I think actually a lot of this is going to depend on what happens nationally about the sector and where that money is coming from, as well as what we also want to do and need to do with the land assets. I think it will always be part of what is a solution for the city, but knowing that we have a community-led housing sector that can deliver is actually going to be crucial to those decisions.
Thank you. So let's bring the room into the conversation. Thank you for that. Please raise your hand if you have a question. The team will pop over with a mic for you. Anybody? I do have more questions, so I can. Wonderful. If you could, I don't know if there's a mic there. Thank you. Any more questions? Please raise your hand. We have one just at the end. I would like to, we've just had two men raise their hands, so I'm just going to, ladies, please, get your hands up.
Sorry. Hello. Rob Logan. I'm one of the councillors for Philwood, which is where Knoll West is. Lisa's the other one. I've always thought that Knoll West was the future, so I'm glad people do. I'm amazed about how much that's come out today. My question, so I choose to be inspired rather than terrified, but I'm only about 55% sure of that. My question is, building on Louise's comment, but broader, how do we do more of it? Because it seems like we've got the ideas, and it seems like we've sort of got the spaces, roughly. They're not difficult, but they're difficult to bring to market. But it seems like we haven't got a programme to do that at more than the scale that we've got at the moment. And we know that that's not going to deliver anything like the scale that we need. So how do we get from here to there? Apart from waiting for national funding, how do we get the scale that we need in that way?
Sure. We'll take three. So we have one just over there, one here, and then another one if anyone else wants to get ready.
Hi there. I'd like to ask a bit more about the carbon budgets, and because they've come up in a couple of presentations. Because it seems to me that we kind of have a choice nationally and internationally about how we use the carbon budgets we have. So if we deprioritise things like road building and other high-emitting sectors, would that give us more allowance for housing, or do you think that it's just, you know, the crisis is so much that we just need to completely decarbonise housing and reduce that?
We have one at the back.
Apologies if this was explained, but it seems I'm a bit unclear on what We Can Make is as an organisation, as a developer and enabler, and it ties in a bit to the question of public versus private, perhaps. Like, I'm unclear if this land that is currently public is being sold into private hands through the system, community or not, and whether or not there would be a better mechanism to keep it as public-owned land, or maybe it is, but I wasn't clear on that.
So we'll take those three initially. Shall we start with that last question, Melissa, and then we'll work our way backwards?
Yeah, so We Can Make is a community land trust. So we're set up to ensure community benefit in perpetuity. So the land that we're talking about is being held for community benefit, you know, forever, really. And I always say that community-led housing is the best kind of affordable housing because it stays affordable forever, because it's exempt from right to buy. Quite often, affordable housing is affordable once and then it gets sold on. So locking in community ownership in this way is a way to kind of take land out of the market and lock in long-term stewardship and long-term community benefit. So I think what we're trying to look for, and we're deliberately kind of like trying to build a big tent here, and for those kind of motivated towards kind of spatial justice and building the homes we need within planetary boundaries, you know, there's a role for all kind of a lot of people in there. What we have at the moment is such a heavily financialized housing system, which is massively over-dependent on large volume house builders, who their profit is a profit motive. And they deliberately kind of limit the kind of construction of new homes to keep the house high. They've been found to be making supernormal profits at the expense of all of us. And so, yes, absolutely, there is still a role for kind of commercial private sector, but let's right-size it so we're not wholly dependent on them. And this is actually something that, Dan, you set out in an excellent report, which I thoroughly recommend, Housing as a Common Good. And this is like, maybe like, what if we could have just a third of the housing delivered by that kind of market kind of housing, a third by council, and a third by not-for-profit. And I think what we're calling for, you know, this is part of this report, is let's bring community-led into the mainstream. Don't let's just leave us with the scraps. We're currently 0.4% of housing stock in the UK. And that's like lower historically than it's ever been. It's much lower than anywhere else in Europe. We should be stepping up to being 10, 20, 30% of housing delivery. And that would lock in long-term affordability and homes that are actually good for people and the planet. So we're asking for a right size of housing delivery. A bit less going through the kind of private sector route and much more going through the not-for-profit and common good kind of housing that we're calling for.
Thank you. Sorry. No shade at Melissa whatsoever, but please, panelists, if you could keep your answers short. Thank you.
I feel quite strongly about that one.
Who wants to tackle the carbon question that we had from this side?
I can have a go, but just a sneaky little addendum to Melissa's. Just to put it in proportion, it's somewhere like the Netherlands has about 29% public housing. So we're about 19 or so. It used to be way more than that in the UK because of right to buy. In England, at least that's gone. In Scotland, I think they've got rid of right to buy, I believe. They just took that out, which would be a good thing to do in England, actually, because they'd stop losing that public asset in that way. And someone like Zurich, for instance, has about 30%, or is voting for, the citizens actually voted for about 30% cooperative or shared housing. So just to put it in perspective, we're not talking about extreme completely out of kilter things here. And Zurich is hardly a bunch of hippies, by the way. There was, as you'd probably be aware, and given a choice in a referendum, they said we want about 30% cooperative housing because that would balance the housing market, which would good for them, essentially. So this rebalancing question, just on the carbon side, that would be absolutely the thing to do. What we got to with our reduction stuff was we just looked at the proportion that's allocated to the built environment sector at the moment, and then to what should the target be within that. Now, if you then put all of the carbon onto the table, as we need to, as Indy pointed out, we need a systemic approach and a global approach to this ultimately, and then we need to think probably more in terms of bioregions than nations at some point. Nonetheless, yeah, if you were able to shift carbon around, emissions rather, around, then yes, you could decide to allocate more to housing if you reduced it from road building, but we've got to be really conscious of we still have a vanishingly small amount of materials in which to work with in the first place. So there is no, to echo my friend's point here, there's no silver bullet, there's no easy answer here. And reframing the way we make decisions around resources, thinking of them as a finite reserve, essentially, a budget or something to work with, would make a massive difference immediately. At the moment, we just have these things running separately as if there's infinite amount of them, and there is no tallying up ultimately, and we need to get to that.
Thank you. And then we just have a question around how do we scale. I don't know, Louise, Indy, want to tackle that one?
I don't know. I'm being honest at the moment, I don't know. I think not necessarily in Bristol, because city centre community-led housing is actually a lot more challenging than, say, the community-led housing that is being delivered in rural areas. In our rural areas, we have registered providers who are stepping up much more frequently to work with community-led housing providers to bring their money and their skill to the land ownership that Melissa's spoken about. So the community-led ownership, retaining that land in perpetuity, making sure it's meeting local housing need, and making sure it's really ingrained and providing a benefit back to the local community is there. But the registered providers then picking up with a lot of the cost and a lot of the expertise and driving the difficult bit. In Bristol, the sorts of sites we've got coming forward, our RP sector generally isn't that engaged. We've got a few stepping up, I will say, and they are coming in on some very small sites that they wouldn't normally do. So for me, it's what can we do to be really encouraging our RP sector to step in and take that role. But unless, quite frankly, we have a community-led sector in the city that wants to work with RPs, which many don't because the products they're delivering are much more specialist, a lot more co-housing, maybe even moving into community self-build type arenas. And the sector wants to get involved. It is very difficult. So do we wait for us to understand a little bit more about what's coming out with the funding for SME developers? Do we ask our community-led housing sector to consider themselves as SME developers and taking advantage of some of the money that has been announced by government? That's a solution when we see the answers. Will we see anything through the new affordable housing funding money that's been advertised from Homes England for community-led housing? Until we've seen the detail there, we don't know. That still fundamentally doesn't change the challenge of that early development cost. How do sites get to planning to a point where the funding can then be brought in? And at the moment, Rob, I don't have an answer today because it is really difficult. We've got a sector here in the city that wants to do stuff, and sadly, a necessity, the money isn't there to enable them to do it. I'm waiting for Melissa's fund because I think that could be absolutely brilliant through the Multi-Max project. You know, if there's a way of linking up the amazing work that's being done here and the rest of our community-led housing sector, then maybe we have a solution.
I think, Louise, don't rely on our fund to do everything.
It's an
yeah,
start.
It is, but I think it's like how do we scale is the question, isn't it? And I think when you have the enormity of the housing crisis, the enormity of the climate emergency, you kind of get a bit scared by it because it just seems, oh my gosh, we need really big solutions. We need big firms, and just big actions the whole time. But I'm actually going to advocate for the power of small. And how do we actually join up? Like, I know there are so many groups and people like doing what we're doing in Knoll West with We Can Make, and have got that energy and have got that inspiration to kind of try and make and do differently. And it's about how do we connect up that energy, and how do we aggregate this power of small. Mentioned earlier, I'm part of something that's called the Mycelial Network, which is a national network of community asset developers who are all working not just to do tiny little isolated projects, but how do we do neighbourhood transformation at scale? And it's about how do we work in a network way and think of ourselves as infrastructure agents. And I think it's like beginning to think about not just our little kind of projects that are in singular community-headed housing projects, but thinking of that as a national community estate. And then we can begin to think about how do we, because there is a ton of money out there. There's an absolute wave of money out there, but it kind of operates at a jet stream of international kind of markets and kind of pension funds. And it's really about how do we make ourselves visible and pull that money down on the right terms to do the things that we want to do. So what we're trying to do, what We Can Make, is take a mutualized approach to this, connecting up those different neighborhoods and those different communities so that we can access and begin to bring in that money on our own terms to do the development we know is needed. Multimax is one part of that. It's one way that we can begin to think about how we do different development differently and build different. And then the other piece of that is how do we mutualize and connect up how we do finance and funding in a different way and get good money in on the right terms. It would be great to have some of that Rachel Reeves' £39 billion for affordable housing, but that's just the start of it. I'm actually thinking bigger than that, and we need to be building the kind of resources for the kind of level of transformation that we need. So this is the moment, and this is what we're advocating for, is that community-led comes into the mainstream. Forget dealing just with the scraps. We actually need to be centre stage in the transition that we are fighting for and that we actually need.
Thank you. So I'm very conscious of time. So I'm going to close the panel. But to close, I'm going to invite each of our speakers, except Melissa, all of the speakers, bar Melissa, if you could share just 30 seconds, 1 minute max, on what next. What should we be watching for, building towards, or acting on from here?
Great. I think I am looking at housing associations becoming neighbourhood care institutions and becoming less about the quantum of stock, but the total quality of care and provision, and an integrated balance sheet between general practice, social housing, and primary care as an integrated neighbourhood level provision, which is, I think, the only way we're going to start to solve this problem in an integrated way, rather than just looking at numbers of units.
Oh, man. I'm terrible at these 1 minute things, as you can tell. I think I'll take a different angle then and talk about the material systems and our connection with them. And I made the point when I was talking about none of us really know where this building came from, and this is an old one, and we kind of should know. Probably is easier to find out than any one of the homes we live in. And that's relatively recent shift, I think. Maybe 100 years ago, someone might have known, or 150 years, that the bricks are from Peter's Brickworks down the road, and the timber's from Indy's Forest, And we've lost our connection with that completely. I don't even really know where my shirt is from. I know how much Indy's costs, but we have any sense of the material provenance, the culture, the history, the resources, what happens to them, where they go next. And so the big shift with buildings really is recognizing that the materials existed before the building, and the materials will exist after the building. And the building itself is just like a frozen moment in time where they're assembled in that particular form. And that's important, but we need to probably shift our perspective more to this material flow, and that's full of possibility in numerous ways, cultural, technical, economic, and otherwise.
Yeah, I'd maybe like to build on some of the things that we've just been talking about in the panel, but maybe first by going back to the talks that you heard originally. I think you've heard the word system quite a lot today, and you've heard it applied to lots and lots of different things. You've heard it applied to obviously systemized things that you attach together in a pre-described way, but you've also heard it described in terms of the whole environment of the atmosphere, and you've heard it described in terms of politics and in terms of finance. And I think I've been watching a lot of Adam Curtis documentaries. There's a new one out, and you know, if you want to know about how systems have changed the way that we think about things, for better and for ill, that's a really good place to start. But what, Melissa, you were just saying then about the idea of bigness and the bigness that sort of systemization and interconnectivity has created, it doesn't feel like it's led us to the answer. And I guess in terms of what we do next, I'd like to speak in support of smallness and in support of the idea that, you know, we're 30 people in East London and we're working in, bizarrely, Seattle, Copenhagen, Milan, because we've found something. But really importantly, I don't think we're going to solve the climate crisis by one person inventing a machine and making all the money. Like, that isn't going to do it, and it is a fundamental shift in the way that we think about things. So I guess what I think is next is more small, more sharing, more generosity of ideas, because the idea of, you know, the Stuart Lee idea of it's my money, that isn't it. It's not my carbon, it's everybody's carbon, it's everybody's home. So it's got to be smallness, it's got to be generosity, and through there somehow maybe hopefully is the solution, but bigness and selfishness, it is not.
Now, I'm going to give I'm a developer at heart. I'm sorry, guys. This is my job. It's my career. Land. I think the biggest asset, or one of the biggest assets we have in the city still is land, the small pockets of land. What we do with it, how we release it, where it's used, whether it's something that the local authority is involved in, a national programme, our community-led housing organisations, whether that's used for community growing, for any other million types of uses for land. It's making sure we identify it and we use it for the best use for that community it's in. So yeah, identifying land and working together to make sure we get that right. Because once it's been built on, in some instances that's it. But yeah, how do we get the absolute best for our communities out of that asset?
Thank you so much. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's been powerful to see how policy and practice and theory can all come together in real projects, especially in places like Bristol. I suppose where the stakes around housing justice are so high, right? So please do continue the conversation outside, at the bar. Hopefully some of our panelists will stick around for you to ask any questions if you had any. And I will give the last word to Melissa.
How many words?
Okay. But like, it's really good to be part of this conversation, and we are trying to build a movement here, and you are all part of that. So this is very much, it is an invitation to continue the conversation, get in touch. And these are really practical ways to get in touch. So download the report, find out, register your interest to see if Multimax could be useful to you. And if you want to get some hands-on making, we're going to have a whole summer of making together, when you're going to be getting hands-on with all sorts of material on site. And the restorative power of kind of like immersing yourself with clay, hemp, timber is a beautiful thing. And so I highly recommend that as one of your first steps. So click here and join the movement. Oh, and one more. We're sort of having a delayed back to hours party on Thursday. So come and see a neighbourhood housing factory in action, and come and have a drink with us and get hands-on with some of the kit and the tools, and chat to some of the neighbours who are doing the action right now in your neighbourhood. So that's on Thursday. Come to Knoll West.